Hello, my name's Harold Halfdan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it would be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we'll be talking about tower houses. Tower houses are fortified houses of the gentry or nobles, found predominantly in Scotland, where they're sometimes called peel towers, and Ireland, and which date to around AD 1400 to 1600. The term tower house and peel towers are modern names for these structures. At the time, they were simply called castles, although I'm sticking with the more modern name of tower house because to call them a castle conjures up the image of an earlier medieval structure with a keep, a curtain wall, and a more complex fortified structure. A tower house, on the other hand, seems to have its antecedents, or in other words, their roots, in a two-story fortified structure called a hull house. Hull houses start to appear around or slightly before AD 1300. Typically in a hull house, there was a central hall, a small spiral staircase, and a sleeping chamber on the second floor over the hall. Tower houses follow this similar layout, but are much more developed structures, with many more floors in their towers. Tower houses are found in the highest concentrations in the southern areas of Scotland, along the Scottish borders with England, and in Ireland along an area known as the Pale, which is around Dublin, but also in the central, south, and western areas of Ireland. The Pale was the area of Ireland directly under English control at the time during the late Middle Ages, and comes from the same root word as the word palisade. All that said, tower houses are found throughout all of Ireland and to a lesser extent throughout Scotland and northern England, but the areas I mentioned previously were where there were their highest concentrations. There are around 2,000 to potentially as many as 3,000 tower houses in Ireland and Scotland. In fact, there are so many that some have suggested that they acted not simply as a fortified dwelling for a specific family, but that they acted together as a defensive network, like a screen, to help protect an overall area. You see, localized conflict was common in the borders between Scotland and England, as well as throughout Ireland, where cattle raiding was also common. A law passed by the English Parliament in 1455 required that every tower house in Scotland have an iron basket at the top of the roof so it could be lit in times of danger to act as a signal fire to warn the surrounding tower houses of any danger that was approaching. Another law, passed in 1429 by King Henry IV of England, paid out a £10 subsidy to those in the Pale in Ireland who built a tower house. There's some debate as to the usefulness of the subsidy, as a great many tower houses were constructed prior to the subsidy being created, and based on our current dating of tower houses, it doesn't appear to have done much to increase construction rates. However the result worked in reality, it appears that the construction of tower houses to better protect and police a potentially problematic area was looked at by the English state at the time as something advantageous, and they must have served a useful purpose on account of there being so many of them. Another fact that points to this is that it wasn't purely the English or Anglo-Irish nobles who built tower houses, but they were also constructed by the Irish nobles as well. Now that we've covered the background, dating, and context around what tower houses were, let's delve into what they looked like. They were typically square or rectangular in shape, although there are some that are L-shaped and others that are Z-shaped. The L-shaped tower houses were able to afford a bit more defensive protection, as the main entrance was placed in the central part of the L, and thus allowed defenders a good line of sight both visually but also to loose arrows at the flanks of any attackers. A Z-shaped tower house had a central rectangular area with two extensions diagonally on either end, so it looked like a Z if viewed from above. More typically, the tower house was simply a square or rectangular shape, with the main entrance being in the center of one of its four sides. The tower house I'm going to be recreating in Minecraft today is that of Ross Castle in County Kerry in the southwest of Ireland, by the Ring of Kerry and the Dingle Peninsula. Just to be clear, while I'm basing my tower house build off Ross Castle and I'm using that as inspiration, it isn't going to be an exact block-for-block recreation. Tower houses contained a ground floor and usually 3 to 6 additional stories above that ground floor. In around 20% of cases, there was also a small outer protective perimeter wall called a bawn wall. These walls were around 2 to 3 meters in height and served the function of keeping attackers away from the tower itself. It's possible that more than 20% had bawn walls, but that the bawn walls were made of wood and have thus since decayed, or have been destroyed since the tower house was being occupied in the late Middle Ages. Inside the bawn wall is the tower house itself. The front door was made of thick wood and had various forms of additional protection. A place for a wooden bar to be attached behind the door was common, and in some instances you see where a chain was also to be attached to help keep the door in place if the tower house was under attack. Occasionally there was something called a yett, which was placed in front of the door. A yett is an iron gate that could be swung outwards or be locked and secured in place. And I'll go into some detail about yetts and some experimental archaeology around them and tower house doors later in the video. For now, let's continue with the tower house description. Once inside the main entrance, there was typically a vestibule, which was simply a small room. In the ceiling between that room and the floor above it would have contained murder holes. Basically, there are holes that could be opened from above into the vestibule below, which allowed the tower's defenders to drop items on the attackers below, such as rocks or boiling liquids. From the vestibule, there was, in 80% of tower houses, a spiral staircase just to the left of the main entrance, which led up to the various floors of the tower. Also, from the vestibule, through a door straight ahead, would be the entrance to the ground floor. The ground floor was the floor that contained supplies and storage. Keeping the supplies there allowed them to be better preserved as it kept those supplies cool and dry. The first floor, in other words the floor above the ground level, often contained sleeping and living quarters for the servants, guards, and household helpers. These sleeping quarters would often simply be straw beds or straw laid on the floor directly. In a tower house that only contained 3 stories above the ground level, the second would often be used as the living quarters for the noble and his family. In many tower houses, this ceiling was vaulted, which helped distribute some of the weight from the floors above into the thick walls of the structure, adding to its stability. Some have also pointed to this as being a helpful feature to help aid in fireproofing. The non-vaulted ceilings in the other floors were held up by wooden beams, which spanned the distance of the tower and supported the wooden floor of the room above. If a fire started in the tower, having a vaulted ceiling would increase the distance between the fire and the ceiling, thus helping mitigate the fire spreading, and having a stone ceiling would help act as a fire break. On the top floor would often be the main hall in tower houses that contained 3 stories. In Ross Castle, the tower house we're creating here in Minecraft, there are 4 stories above the ground floor storage room. In this tower house, between the floor for the servants and attendants and the floor for the nobles' living quarters, there's also a floor of the tower that was dedicated for food production. At the top of the spiral staircase was the access to the roof, from where the defenders could have a great vantage point to view the surrounding countryside, and where, as mentioned previously, there was often an iron basket for being able to light a signal fire. Surrounding the roof line was a crenulated parapet, which allowed defenders to loose arrows down on the attackers from a defended position. They also had matriculations, which were stone structures that protruded from the outer wall with holes in the floor, kind of like the murder holes discussed previously, and like the murder holes, they would allow the offenders to drop stones or boiling liquid or oil on them. These matriculations came in two different varieties, one with a large archway which allowed for better visibility but poorer protection for the defenders above, and the more common square-shaped version. Up to this point, I've described what's typical of most tower houses or Rosscastle, but what's interesting is that access between different floors wasn't also just by using the main spiral staircase. There have been some interesting studies conducted around public and private spaces in tower houses based on areas that were accessible not through the main spiral staircase but through additional stairwells within the tower house. In areas that were designed to be public, often had much more decorated doors and doorways, but if the noble wanted to create an area that was more private and not designed for public viewing, then perhaps the floor or set of rooms of the tower house would only be accessible by using an alternative stairwell, thus making access more secluded. I said earlier in the video that I was going to return to the subject of the yett or iron grill, so let's do that now. And while doing so, we can discuss in a bit more depth about the defensive functionality of the tower house. Having a yett increased the defensive abilities of the tower house immensely in its ability to resist direct attacks on the door. This often came in two forms. First was from a fire being started outside of the door, which could catch the thick wooden door on fire, and second was from a battering ram that was used by the attackers. In both of these cases, having a yett would either stand in the way between the battering ram and the door, or in the case of fire, even if the wooden door was burnt away, attackers would still not be able to pass through the small slots between the iron of the yett. Because of the lack of yett on a vast majority of tower houses, some have questioned if being a defensive structure was indeed its primary function. A team led by Duncan Berryman conducted a bit of cool experimental archaeology where they tested exactly how long and how difficult it would be for an attacker to break through a tower house's typical main door using both of the methods described previously. In the case of fire, his test showed that after a fire was started at the base of the door, it took about 20 minutes until the door began to burn on its own, and after 40 minutes, the door burnt down completely. His test also showed that by using a battering ram, the door could be destroyed in only 5 minutes of ramming. He points out that a yett would have stopped both of these attacks, and if the main entrance was located on the first floor instead of the ground level, as it is on a few, but not the vast majority of cases, it would have done much more to protect the tower house from both of these types of assaults. His test also showed that if a ram was used, the stones around the door and mortar would be damaged by the door and its securing bar giving way. However, when he surveyed the archaeological remains of tower houses looking for that type of damage, he couldn't find any instances of that occurring. Given all that, I don't dispute Duncan Berryman's results, and I find his use of experimental archaeology fascinating. I can't help but wonder, however, how often tower houses were actually placed in direct assault. While he's absolutely correct that a great many tower houses are not fully optimized as an ideal defensive structure, that doesn't necessarily mean that defense wasn't their primary function. Maybe it wasn't necessary to be the most defensive tower house to still be an effective defense. Maybe the defense just had to be good enough to discourage raiders or attackers to attack somewhere else. Think about your own houses we live in today. They all have locks on the doors to stop people breaking in, but let's be real for a moment. If someone was determined to get in your house, your front door or lock would not really be a deterrent, or they could simply go through a window. The real deterrence and defense is to just be strong enough to not make it worth the intruder's time and to have a community around you who can raise an alarm when there's an intruder present, in much the same way as what occurred with the frequency of tower houses and how they often contained a way to notify others of danger using the signal fire. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode where we recreated an Irish tower house based off Ross Castle and chatted about their archaeological importance and history. I included links to some of the articles I found while researching this topic, so you can check them out for yourself if you want to learn more. If you liked this video, please take the time to, give it a like and a subscribe, and leave a comment about what you enjoyed or what I can improve in these videos. Thanks, and have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.